One doesn't seem to know much at the moment, anyway, not enough about Sorin Antohi. This is so because, first of all, contemporary Romania doesn't give a damn on its intellectuals, values, researchers, scholarly activities, and so on. And secondly, because some accidents of Mr. Antohi's biography have replaced in his public profile the substance of his scientific achievements. That's why I invited him here, to give him another chance to express himself as an intellectual, as a researcher, as a scholar, and a very consistent scholar. Let me still say something rapidly about him. As far as the age is concerned, he's younger than me, that's all I have to say. He belongs to a well-known group of intellectuals in Iași, the group of Iași, the Iași group, which became a group before 1989, and several members of this group made brilliant careers afterwards. He studied in Iași. He taught at several universities in Romania and abroad. After 1989, he became a member of the leading team of the Ministry of Education, the first Ministry of Education after December 1989, under the mandate of Mihai Șora. Then he moved to Central European University. He belonged there also to the leading team of this institution. He founded there an Institute for Historical Studies, and he was very close to the rector of that university at that time, late Professor Yehuda Elkana. Also, he became there the editor of the academic journal East European Politics and Societies. I think you are still a member of. No, you are not any longer? Good. And the Wissenschaftskolleg to Berlin, I met him some years ago, and I have to tell you, I'm going there every year, not paid by the Romanian Cultural Institute. And I'm going there, and I always find echoes of his presence there. He's a brilliant, well-remembered fellow of that institution. He deals mainly with intellectual history. He wrote essential books about social imagination, about utopia. He also wrote interview books with important figures of the Romanian intellectual background, like Adrian Marino or Mihai Șora. After 2007, he got a grant at the Leipzig University. In 2010, he spent about a year, I think, in Britain, traveling around from Greece, Mount Athos, up to Hong Kong, giving lectures, ideas, imagining projects, and so on. In 2009, he founded the Berendel Foundation in Britain, with the money of a rich and generous Romanian mecena. And then the Cantemir Institute at the University of Oxford, where several researchers had the chance to deliver lectures, publish texts, and so on. He's also in a team, together with Tiro Schaber in Switzerland, relaunching the famous Eranos Tagungen, and the next one will take place this summer in Romania, at the Monastery of Finance. He has now in mind, as I understand, a project on history and theory of historical studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So as you see, a very colorful, dynamic, productive intellectual, and I think for all that, and for even more than that, he deserves our friendly and intellectual attention. Thank you, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Should I stand or you still have a choice. That's it. I can see all. Professor Pleșu, thank you very much. Professor Sorin Antohi, thank you very much for this occasion. It is true, I have lost the habit of addressing Romanian audiences for better and for worse. And so if I'm given the chance to do so, I jump at the opportunity and I use English. Also take advantage of the presence of a small international audience. Small but select international audience. I'm going to speak for about 40-45 minutes. This is the protocol here. And I'm going to deliver a talk rather than a lecture. It was advertised as a talk. I shall deliver a talk. You know the title. You reminded immediately to you. And I try to lead you through what has been my major intellectual fixation for the last 20 years or so. Has resulted in a number of publications and a number of manuscripts that are still await publication. I'm going to go rather straight to the point, which is the model or the paradigm of ethnic ontologies. I'm going to spare you the footnotes. I'm going to spare you, I'm not going to name names really. I'm not going to do too much name dropping. I'm going to get you to the points that I want to make. And to do so, I really need to go rather quickly through a number of difficult topics in the history of ideas. Funnily enough, whenever I was speaking about this topic, ethnic ontologies in Western Europe, Western audiences assumed quite, I would say, boldly and orientalistically that this would be a story about Romania, a story about some atavistic peculiarity of Romania that makes it possible for people to imagine a cosmic setting for their history, or rather instead of their history. In Romania, I hope this would not be the case. On the other hand, since I'm doing this in English, I cannot indulge. I cannot use too many Romanian examples, since the fine print of all those Romanian examples is always very difficult to translate. I hope that in the discussion we'll address some of these issues. So, the title of my talk is then The Cosmic Sentiment of Identity, the Romanian Ethnic Ontologies and Their European Context. This is, of course, a history of ideas, of both concepts and figures, their contexts, and of their discourses about them. If you could bear with me for these 40 minutes, 45 minutes, then I would ask you to do something else, to try to imagine as a kind of passo continuo, the history of disciplines and discourses that has been tackling these issues that I'm going to talk about over the last 150, 200 years. Because in most cases, although these ideas have been always there, in one corner or the other of all the successive paradigms shaping intellectual and scholarly discourses in all European countries, This is a story which usually is not told. It is difficult to tell because this means a sociology of knowledge, in the Mannheimer sense of this sociology, a history of discourses and disciplines, as I said. But this is there. Ideas that have been almost always there, in various positions, in various constellations, have been shaped and framed differently by different discourses and disciplines. This story, if you can imagine it, you can imagine it as starting in the 18th century, when, let's say, the field was defined by largely a polarity of new radical Christian refoundation of philosophy, theology, and what was the very, very early embryo of the future social sciences. You have, on the other hand, the more rational, it's hubris, of course, but tendency that came to define the Enlightenment as the age of reason. And in between these two clusters of disciplines and discourses, from theology to the emerging natural sciences, one hand also another field which is interesting and got lost in most histories of the 18th century, namely the rise of what is called usually the Western esotericism, building on traditions that first go back centuries and include things such as the Christian Kabbalah and all the other forms of esotericism leading all the way up to the 20th and the 21st century avatars of esotericism. In many ways, these three clusters have been interacting with one another and have displaced each other or have replaced each other, changed each other over, let's say, 200 years. This is why the story is rather complicated. Of course, I'm looking at ethnic ontologies as, I see ethnic ontologies as the climax of a process which has its roots back in time, but only could develop in the interwar period throughout Europe. I shall focus on Romania, but this is a European dynamic. Now, a Romanian scholar, Virgil Nemoianu, teaching in the United States, has once written a book which is called A Theory of the Secondary. And in this book he suggested ideas never disappear, forms never disappear. They somehow linger on, stay there somehow in various corners of the various cultures, cultural memories, and of course are taken up again, mixed with something else, with other ingredients, and they never leave us. They enjoy this logic, this dynamic of the secondary, which makes them in fact more productive or continuously productive over many, many years, although they do not seem to occupy the forefront of intellectual debates. They are always there. This is a different, you have noticed, this is a different take on the idea of the persistence of concepts or figures. It's different from such things as archetypes or paradigms and so forth. It is a literary, let's say, take on this resilience and productivity of ideas. Thus, whenever you hear of something that happened 200 years ago, do not consider it dead. It is in fact undead. We are in Romania, Vlad the Imperial's country, Dracula's country. We should not shy away from the idea of the undead. These concepts are always there, are somehow fueling different courses of argument, different forms of thought, different paradigms, they never leave. Intro-Romania, I'll just put it in a nutshell, for non-Romanian listeners, or for those who have opened their TV sets a little bit later than the rest of us. It was a very complex construction. It was the absolutely unexpected outcome of a complex ending of World War I. But suddenly Romania became big, very big, bigger than ever imagined, and in fact only slightly smaller than the most outrageous and imaginative vision of Greater Romania, which actually belongs to a French general. He, in a very interesting correspondence with interesting authors of let's say, players of the time, had the fantasy of a Romania opening on 3 seas. Because of course this was the new idea from Mackinder and other people talking about imperial spaces and imagining the stability of oceanic empires. And he actually thought up a very interesting algorithm. Just had to do some maybe population transfers and do some trade-offs with the other losers of the and some of the winners of World War I, in such a way that Romania, through its Romanian connection, some of them my ancestors, and through Istria would open on the warmer seas. It didn't work out. No Romanian had ever thought about this, incidentally. This was much bigger than Greater Romania. Nonetheless, Greater Romania was great enough, was large enough, and was extremely diverse. Thus, this diversity came to be perceived both as a problem, as a challenge for the state, in the sense of the sheer management of extraordinary diversities of all sorts, linguistic, ethnic, confessional, and so on. And the solution to that, for some, was of course an ever-growing standardization of Romanianness, which was first defined in poetical, metaphysical terms in the 19th century, but came to be conceived in a very narrow sense, non-political, however, not part of the social political contract, but in a form which is basically ethnic and not national. This is why I say ethnic ontologies are the national ontologies, which is, let's say, a more appropriate understanding of what was going on, especially in Romania, but also in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, where the ethnic rather than the national was the principle of cohesion, or the principle around which collective identities were being shaped up for better and for worse. This sheer diversity and the attempt by many to evade the problems raised by this sheer diversity fueled, not only inspired, but fueled the rise of a series of visions of the nation and visions of the national polity, which were reframed in ethnic terms, again, rather than social political, contractualist, and actually peaked in the 1920s and 30s in the form of what I call ethnic ontologies. You will get the point. So the point was diversity. The other challenge that Romania was facing, or had been facing for centuries, was the challenge of its geographical location, which was this complex intersection of borderlands of contested borderlands of all sorts, and thus a certain tendency to ignore, if not to evade, to escape, at least in the imagination, in the social imaginary, these constraints, which are geographical, today we would say geopolitical, was taking shape. Thus, interest in an alternative imagination of the ethnic, or if you want, ethno-national territory became important. This resonated from the beginnings of modern Romanian culture with the romantic, palingenetic vision of a rebirth of all these dormant peoples of Europe, following the call first in 1789, when not too many nations actually heard or could understand the call, and later on throughout the first decades of the 19th century. Of course, this first palingenesis of the 1840s is the rebirth of the unborn. It is the rebirth of something that did not exist, had to be invented almost from scratch, and it did. It was invented, indeed, all over the place. Romania is no exception in this sense. Nonetheless, this particularity of Romania, its lack of convenient, usable historical references that would warrant a political, historical reading of its past, made it possible and even tempting, and I would say at some point even unavoidable and interesting and rewarding, to imagine the notion, the national, the ethnic national self, or collective self, as inhabiting a space which was qualitatively different from the space inhabited by others. This was, in the language of the 1840s, replete with biblical references, of course. In Romania, they were not coming from the Bible in Romania. These sons of Boyas are not reading the Bible in Romania. Absolutely. It was also pretty new as a mass market book, the Bible in Romania, as we know. It was still new. In the mid-19th century, the print runs of the Romanian Bible were negligible. In Slavonic, of course, this was a different matter, that people had started to lose their Slavonic, their Church Slavonic, were somehow in a limbo, couldn't read any of the two. So, but of course, as we know, these influences came especially through direct contacts between these sons of Boyas from the Romanian principalities and, well, let's say the utopian socialists, the left-leaning or the liberal-leaning Catholics in France. If I give you the name of Lamennais, this is the idea. Right? So they were reading this kind of, which brings me to a very important point that I think one should remember. It took me many years to get to this point. Namely that whenever we are looking at these qualitative, again, categories such as space, which I have just mentioned, time, or national character, rephrased and reframed as national being, we should not lose sight of the persistence and appeal of these not so Christian, not quite, let's say, kosherly Christian references that were floating in the zeitgeist of the early 19th century, and were actually carried by the legacy of those darker, somber, nocturnal sides of the Enlightenment, of the Aufklärung, which I have alluded to before, namely a refoundation of Christianity and this beginning of Western esotericism. If you want, I can still give you three names here. I think I can have a triad between someone like Oettinger in 18th century Germany, who is reinventing Christianity in a very interesting radical way. On the other, at the rational end, you have Immanuel Kant, working very hard on his critical works. However, being excited about something that was developing in the middle, in this relatively vague middle ground, on this middle ground on which various forms of esotericism, various forms of Naturphilosophie, various forms of other paradigms were interacting and were shaping each other. And the name for this is, of course, Swedenborg. It took me many years to get to retrace, actually, when these people are reading each other. Right? And, this is not only that Kant himself was reviewing Swedenborg and had very, let's say, almost cynical things to say and dismissive things to say, but he had read this very attentively, and on the other hand, at the very University of Königsberg, Swedenborgians were very numerous, and many of them would attend Kant's classes with that in mind. I made this interesting discovery that this was the case, obviously, for the very popular course delivered by Kant for 50 odd years, which was his course on geography. He was not talking about geography, of course. We don't really know what he was talking about. We do have, even in the best academic editions, we do have course notes taken towards the end of his life by one of his disciples, but Kant was already decaying and he could never check, so we don't really know exactly, but it is true that over 50 years, this course in which he was talking about the entire world, picking up influences and the ideas from absolutely every possible corner of the episteme of the time, constituted, I would say, a kind of interesting negotiation or field of exchanges and negotiations on which better known figures such as Herder, but also lesser known people were learning about all the world. This is why I do not hesitate to use this label, ethnic ontologies, although of course ontology has to be taken relatively, let's say, has to be taken lato sense. These are not categories, they are pseudo-categories. Time, space. Kantian categories are problematic as well, as we well know. And the passage between the pre-critical phase in Kant, these extraordinary influences from other streams of thoughts of the 18th century made their way into the thinking of someone who was to become the most influential thinker of the collective self in post-Enlightenment Europe, Herder. From Herder down, everything goes rather quickly and everybody can understand how the theorization of collectives, of ethno-national collectives came about. That is from there, it is relatively easy to figure out. You can see the impact that Herder had all over the place. this transition from something else to another is important. I'll give you one example, space. I use the notion of qualitative space, although probably the most widely known is the notion of symbolic geography. Symbolic geographies have become very popular in the 80s and 90s, especially when dealing with relatively exotic areas of Europe, such as the East and the Southeast. You cannot find a good book on the theories applied to the symbolic geography of Europe. There is very little in terms of theoretical background to this. There has been an attempt to offer a relatively sexy idea such as mental mappings, something that was smuggled from fields such as cognitive sciences or linguistics or mathematics or topology and brought into the human sciences without those using it, understanding much from this. But in fact, what everyone was trying not to avoid, because most of them simply didn't know that such a thing existed, was the idea of sacred spaces, of sacred mystical eschatological topographies and spaces. This is why when I use the name, the more neutral qualitative space, I'm trying to bring under the same umbrella a very long-term tradition of sacred topographies leading into this new secular imagination of the 18th century, which has given, among others, the stereotype of the European East. Whenever we discuss these notions of qualitative space, we have to go back centuries, if not millennia, and we have to remember that this is there in the, even if forgotten by most, they are still there fueling the vision of time, space, which is cosmic, not historic, which is atemporal and ahistorical. Thus, these notions that shape ethnic ontologies, space, time, to stick for a while with this, are cosmic notions, are cosmic categories. We are talking here about space, not about territory, for instance, national territory. Nobody gives a damn on the absolutely concrete, exact historical territory, the border and so forth. When you engage in the making of ethnic ontologies, you simply want to escape from those constraints and also forget about them. Because whatever you find there is not really very, not only pleasing, but doesn't help you to have a very, let's say, felicitous definition of oneself. The same is true of time. So just as in the case of space, of qualitative space, when you find very deep history going back to alternative qualitative visions of space, from Axis Mundi to any number of visions of qualitative space, such as, for instance, the Garden of Eden, or whatever, any other geography or cosmology related usually to Christianity, because they are doing their work with the Abrahamic religions as we have in Europe. The same is true when we discuss time. Lingering in the background, you always find the mythical, prehistorical time or ahistorical time, the Illu Tempus, or another version of this qualitative time. So the project of the ethnic ontologists is to locate the ethnic nation in a cosmos which is endowed with this set of idiosyncratic, universal and yet autochthonous categories such as time, space, language. Of course, time and space, we are pretty much clear what they are about. When you talk about language, of course, this is the vision of the primordial or Adamic language, or the perfect language. The ethnic nation speaks the first language that was ever spoken by God, by Adam, by whoever. In any case, something that goes really, literally back to times immemorial, and of course, every other language is just a ridiculous, if occasionally bold, imitation or corruption of the perfect language which is there and coincides with. This is of course something that goes beyond the history of the language, goes back in time, millennia, and once again endows the ethnic group, let's say the ethnic nation, with a Weltanschauung of its own, but moreover, which is, let's say, the way this group sees itself and the world, but also with the cosmos of its own, which is now, this is why previous ruminations and reflections on collective identity were not enough. And I'll give you another famous example, of course, national character, or the discourse on national characterology. From humanists up, this is a flourishing field all over the place in Europe. Lots of people talking about the way collective selves are made. Now, if you look especially at this discussion about the ethnic national self, which would be, let's say, the phenomenology of what, as a concept, we call Romanianness, or if you want Hispanidad, if you want something more elegant, then if you want to see what's going on, what phenomenology is there behind this concept, what you find is not national characterology. National characterology was long abandoned in the early 19th century in most civilized countries in Europe, and was reshaped, reformatted with the input of the emerging social sciences or humanities, fields such as Psychologie, later on experimental psychology, and other forms of framing what Herder, for instance, was calling the soul of the ethnic nation, of the folk. Folks, Seele, and he spoke also especially about the folks last. From Seele, however, comes directly the idea of sentiment, and this would be in itself a good excursus one other evening at the Net. Now, in the case of Romania, to go very quickly, the first attempt by the generation of 1848 was to imagine a world, a new cosmos for their own ethnic nation, which was in the making. So they were, of course, very imaginative and intricate, and they were picking up the pieces for this construction wherever they could find it. In Romania, I think one finds a very interesting example of the complete, you could find the complete trajectory of the invention of tradition in ways that in other parts of the world it is a little bit more difficult to identify. Romanians will immediately, I think, jump when I say one word, Miorița. Miorița in the 1840s did not exist. Was a cluster of regional, provincial versions of a ballad. In other words, it was not even a ballad, it was a kind of carol. It had something else in other areas and anything. Once, however, there was demand for such productions, and demand was at the time in Paris. Jules Michelet was busy teaching the French nation all the virtues they had forgotten since 1789, and he was absolutely desperate to find wherever possible throughout Europe, and especially in this northern Europe, where for some reason he was placing Romania, something which would be so edifying, so irresistible, that would change the French, I would say, Frenchmen into perfect citizens at the time, to bring them back into the enthusiasm and the spirit of 1789. I don't think this was such a wise idea, but this was what Jules Michelet was doing. And since he was personally connected in many ways, I do not go into details here, to the Romanian elites studying in Paris, he was very interested to pick up anything like this, even if invented. And thus, Vasile Alexandri, well, provided just that. Among another, so it is they were actually offering Michelet a large number of publications, folkloristic publications, including Miorița. Miorița, however, who was not particularly singled out by Michelet himself, was reimported and was taken up by the Romanian elites. If one reads the Legende Evocative du Nord, one finds, by my reckoning, absolutely fabulous. They are fabulous indeed, in fact, fabrications. Actually, one with the snake of the house, very, very, very beautiful, completely invented, which Michelet liked particularly. Miorița not necessarily, but it was reimported. Then it became the national epos that we never had, but a kind of replacement of the national epos that we never had. It had this extraordinary advantage of not being historical, and thus not needing any kind of documentation or any kind of palpable, documentable depth. And its circuit goes on throughout the interwar period, and it comes back to us as the Romanian ethnic ontology of the 1930s, which probably made the largest impact. And this is in the work of Lucian Blaga, who produced a fully fledged ethnic ontology written in a beautiful language, which, of course, makes us forget and makes most readers of Blaga forget the very obvious and the very well documented by the author himself influences and ingredients that he was using from Western European cultures, especially from the German. So he was reading Frobenius, he was reading Alois Riegel, he was reading Boehringer, he was reading a number of other authors. But no Romanian reader of Blaga, well, very few Romanian readers of Blaga paid any attention to the very carefully footnoted influences from, and everybody was able to take up this as an absolutely purely autochthonous product, which was elevating this romantic fabrication of the 1840s at the level of ethnic ontology, because there you find certain specific vision of space. I spare you the details. Romanians know it. Foreigners don't need to know. The idea is that there is an undulating space which is characteristic of Romania. It is true that already at the time there were people who thought otherwise, especially the person to whom he dedicated this very work, Spațiul Neolitic, Vasile Băncilă, who had the idea of coming up with something else, which was Spațiul Bărăgani. He noticed as he was living in Brăila that there was this swamp around him and this apparently endless plain. So he couldn't do much with this vision of this alternance of vale and dale and hills. No use to that. I gave you this example to show how always at the level of high culture and always making up the core of high culture for about 100 years, a process by which ethnic ontologies were built was first triggered by the poetic, metaphysical, mystical vision of the chosen land, chosen nation, chosen language, whatever it is. A terrestrial paradise in every possible sense. That at the time seemed to be enough. It went through the transformations that were brought about by the development of new disciplines. And I'm just going to list them rapidly. I mentioned psychology, of course. I should mention anthropogeography, or human geography. I should mention a vast section of historical sciences in Germany that was imported together with this new thinking in geography at the universities of Berlin and Leipzig into the very famous Annales School, especially via the magnificent work of Vidal de la Blache and via his extraordinary concept of possibilisme, which in fact replaces the very rudimentary determinism of anthropogeography with something which is softer, which is more flexible, which is in fact more promising and gives rise to cultures, very much like in the vision that Leo Frobenius had of the interaction between ideas, human cultures, geomorphological environments, which came up as a notion by Doima in Romanian, as a kind of super unit of which was also phrased as Kulturkreis, or let's say spatially anchored, I would say, cultural code, if I were to put it very crudely in a number of categories. Now, when new ideologies, because they also have to be imagined, they have to be developing alongside these discourses and disciplines. When new disciplines develop, I mentioned Göringer, I mentioned Riegel, there's this new notion of style, of something that is over-encompassing and characteristic. This is something that, of course, Blaga was very interested in, picked up immediately, and came to use and integrate in this ethnic ontology, although let's say this was not absolutely necessary because it was a little bit more particularistic than he needed. But I'm showing this, let's say, very opportunistic, in fact, way in which theory makers, theory builders, through all these decades or 150 years, are using the ingredients which are on offer from the diversity of disciplines around. And on this I'm going to close, and there will be time for discussion. I hope I'll be able to answer some of your questions here. What happens after this peak of ethnic ontologies. And then for Romanians only, I gave the list there in the abstract. These are the people that one should read. Of course, Vulcănescu, Noica, Cioran, who is an apophatic, let's say the negative correspondent of this infatuation with one's nation, and in this sense he contributes actually something that appears to be at first a radical national characterology, going all the way to self-stigmatization and in fact self-annihilation, to nothingness, expression of le néant valac, le néant roumain. But they all belong here. If I were to speak on another occasion, I would also include some of the theologians, or quasi-theologians. I would talk about Stanislav, of course, talk about mavericks such as Nikifor, because they are all moving in this space. But the space in my mind is defined. I mean, the limits of this conversation, or the framework of this conversation, the paradigm, is defined by this attempt of, yes, boycotting history with the very apt phrase of one of these interworld luminaries, an attempt to escape the constraints of geography, of history, in short, of reality, and establish a vertical relationship between the ethnic nation and some form of transcendence, usually circular, bringing it back to the imitation of the nation itself. It's a kind of circular process by which you jump always in order to come back into a form of autochthonist, almost tonic vision of the collective self. Now, this process goes on until something new shows up, and this is really my last point, when biology takes over, and when experimental biology becomes important, and the Regina Scientiarum, I pronounce like this for those who don't know that this is pronounced Regina Scientiarum. We know better, you Italians and Europeans, you know better how Latin needs to be pronounced. And when biology became fundamental new science, which was almost becoming gnosis, like all sciences when they come to be to enjoy a hegemonic position in the paradigm or in the episteme. And thus, biology offered the possibility of going even further, and thus bringing experimental, absolutely infallible experimental laboratory measurements to establish whether someone belonged or not to the collective self. First of all, you define it, of course, in serological racial terms. You, like in every other paradigm before and after, political paradigm before and after, you have to address the sheer diversity of the population you want to manage. And of course, once you establish beyond any reasonable doubt that anyone who doesn't belong has to be brought in line or vaporized. But what I'm saying is that, and I'm saying this for Romanians, what I'm saying is that, unfortunately, this discussion that I just sketched a little bit here, which in Romania is based on the code phrase specificul național, national specificity, has been almost exclusively tackled by literary scholars who, for reasons that escape me, I'm polite, never considered the connections and the inspirations and the influences that actually led to this. The most iconic text about national specificity, which is the last chapter in the monumental history of Romanian literature by Perinescu, is absolutely explicit. You cannot get better than this. It is the words that you want to identify, erase. He is this short, relatively short text, is a compendium of what I have been trying to describe. Last using more words and alluding to more paradigms than him, of this precise circuit of this fabrication from the romantic and yes, luminous and encouraging and moving visions of the terrestrial Eden of the ethnic nation, all the way in the second, when the second palingenetic wave, the darker one, the somber one, which is in Romania the avant-garde essentially, and the eugenicists, when this came about, it was using very much the elements that were already inscribed in the canon of high culture in Romania. This is why they enjoyed such an extraordinary diffusion, and this is why, I will close on that, most people didn't even understand that they were talking so plainly about such brutal things, because they simply had forgotten the footnotes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Antohi, for this very rich talk. And now, if there are comments, questions, reflections, perplexities, please don't hesitate to express them.
Before you reading the second edition of Dorli Blaga's book on her father the other week, this I have to quote. I have a number of quotes related to Miorița that I particularly like. One was delivered to me by the late Adrian Marino in a private letter, where he said that Miorița does not belong to European zoology. And I had to agree. The other thing is this very perceptive, actually, note by Constantin Brăiloiu, the musicologist and the ethnomusicologist, who had the leisure escaping from Romania to think about matters Romanian in Switzerland and in other places. And he made a very, very good point once, saying that Miorița, timpul înghițit de spațiu, time swallowed by space. And I think, but the nice quote here I wanted to bring here is from Dorli Blaga. Dorli Blaga hears that Nicolae Tertulian, the philosopher, was working on the reconsideration of Blaga's philosophy. And we find this from, and she says, vreți să construiți socialismul în spațiul mioritic? Do you want to build socialism in the mioritic space? I think this is the, let's say, the most cynical, how should I say, coda to Blaga's incredibly beautiful enterprise, which is philosophically actually quite interesting, and is in keeping, as I said, with the similar productions in the West, and poetically and linguistically is way above many of his models in the West. And you cannot, basically you cannot read Leo Frobenius. I tried, I did my best. It's hard. Has written a lot of the poor thing. And his personal library is forgotten in one depot in Central California, belonging to the University of Stanford. Nobody, I called all those things in the fall of 1999. Nobody had ever done this before. So.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. My question is about your use of the term ontology. It is clearly motivated by the Romanian sources. But I was wondering, what is your take on, let's say, the new currency that this term has gained in the past 5 or 6 years, particularly in disciplines such as
computer science, linguistics, like this?
Yes, and anthropology and new material studies and new form of ecologies, particularly leftist ecologies. In other words, disciplines that are in some way or other dealing with the other than human, be it, the spirit, the god, or the green creature, or the bioengineered being, or the artificial being, such as the corporation. And it strikes me that in the Romanian case, there is a obvious lack of such, let's say, other beings. It is a very poor ontology, almost a form of solipsism, let's say, when it's completely asocial. So my question would be, is there a parallel social discourse going alongside these ethnic ontologies, or do they really exist by themselves?
They are fabrications, of course, all of them. They are intellectual objects. They are intellectual objects. They are abstract mental objects. They do not exist, of course, in any tangible way or in any strong ontological way. Now, the more recent, let's say, development using the word ontology, spearheaded by developments in computer science, in linguistics, in cognitive sciences, there is, for instance, when you read this up, there is a project of a national national ontology. This is why I say ethnic. Now, my former student at the University of Central European University, Bucharest, who has also taught some of his colleagues, has taught some of these people in Romania, picked up the notion of national ontology from me many years ago, and because he had to deal with, although most of the time he speaks about ethnic ontologies, in the Romanian, Bulgarian cases, obviously, but also in the Hungarian. In the Hungarian case, of course, one could argue that due to the existence of a massive historical, cultural, theological corpus of sources, of course, such fabrications have their careers are less successful. Not so in the interwar period, when they were quite successful as well, but they are always associated with cultural historical materials. I think the very fact that we are lacking much of these materials encouraged Romanian authors to jump at the opportunity of building these abstract worlds for which historical, cultural footnotes are absolutely negligible, do not count. But I would say that the same figures of thought and the same systematic approach to build an idiosyncratic universe for the ethnic nation can be identified in many other countries, not only in Central and Eastern Europe. I do not need to mention names such as Heidegger or very big names like that to see that these people are in absolutely excellent company. But if one reads, coming here with Daniel Perdigao and Virgil Mihai, we're talking about the fact that there was no need to build such a thing in Portugal when they had such a rich history, when Fernando Pessoa had something to wait for, which is the second coming of the lost king, of Sebastian the lost king. Why would they bother to build something else. They had something which was already there, historically grounded, quite attractive. They didn't have much of that. If you move across the, let's say, the relatively recent border into Spain, then speculations about Hispanidad are different. They include a lot of historical materials, especially from Castile, Aragon, not from other areas. Difficult to use materials from Galicia or from areas such as that. It's very difficult to use them. I don't say the Basque country, of course. But they, and of course we know that they went all the way up to Berlin and Leipzig to listen to these intelligent Germans and came back with the idea of sentimiento and all these things that we have. The generation of '98. This is something that somehow puts into a very interesting comparative perspective the contemporaneous Romanian authors, were those who were picking up somebody like Unamuno or Ortega. I would claim, maybe this was also the case with Cioran, who however said all the time that he was interested in Teresa de Avila, San Juan de la Cruz and so forth. But I think there is a more, let's say, real, historical occurrence there, which is the fact that like the Spaniards, Romanians are now converging on Berlin and Leipzig to listen to the ways in which nations are now being theorized there at the turn of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. This was the cutting edge of thinking about ethnicity, nations, Völkerpsychologie, and this had its impact on France, obviously. I mentioned a little bit, and I do not count the number of former students from Central and Eastern Europe who are learning all this stuff in Berlin. And so I think, to close here, I think we are, well, in Romania, I'm not familiar, I don't know whether there is Romanian transhumanism or there is a discussion about this. There might be. It will come, I'm sure. I'm absolutely hopeful there will be a time for that. What I'm saying is that even these Finns who are at the cutting edge of national ontologies in IT and so forth were doing exactly the same things at the time in the 1930s. Absolutely the same things. They fabricated the national epos, they did everything they could up to eugenicism and so forth, and the other Scandinavians. So that's similarities.
And remember that Cioran, in the end, defined Romanianness as a version of Hispanidad. Romania is a Spain without Don Quixote. This was his definition in the end. Now, any other? Yeah.
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, Michelet placing Romania somewhere in the north, and you also mentioned, you had mentioned Harry Wolff before, who incidentally putting Eastern Europe on the map of the Enlightenment speaks about Scythian Scythoi that travelled on the map all the way and usually placed on the northern shore of the Black Sea, which is very interesting. I was just wondering to what extent the north invites such ethnic essentialisms. Yeah, the other word would be essentialism for ontology. That was my point. But what do you make of someone as Madame de Stael, who speaks of de l'Italie, de l'Allemagne, before there is anything like that? And she incidentally takes the case of something, or two somethings, if you like, that had traditionally been very fragmented, very non-national, and very little prone to what later on politically you would have built as a kind of romanticized national identity.
The north is empty, and thus I think invites imagination to to simply go to stray and develop all these things. Of course, in the north of Europe, if I'm not talking Scandinavia, if I'm talking northeastern Europe, all the spaces, the various Rus and up to the Urals, I think the most exciting fabrication is the fabrication of Crimea by Potemkin, of course, and by Catherine the Great. Everybody knew when Catherine the Great went all the way to Crimea that whatever they were showing her was not reality. It was the shape of things to come. It was the future empire. She was no fool, absolutely. Potemkin was not fooling the empress. Everybody knew that this was the vision of a time to come. And the idea of this travel was to go to descend from the north and find a form of more ancient Europeanness, which is the Argonauts in Crimea, in Kolkida, and show that long before all these Germans had anything to teach Peter the Great and so forth, these guys were European, so they were more European than the Northern. So it was a way of shifting this axis of this civilizational slope on the map of Europe, and thus investing something that is, let's say, Eastern Central, with civilizational excellence and tradition which trumps its being placed on the map at the outskirts of civilized Europe. So you can say that, what were you doing exactly when the Argonauts were roaming the Black Sea? Not much, you Brits and Germans, whatever you are. So this was a way of dealing with that. Yeah, and the other thing was... Madame de Staël was... well, she was coming from a nation, and so she could see nations where others couldn't. So she was projecting, of course, this... as we remember, all these smart Germans became very excited about this, and while teaching her very little German, and while she was teaching them a lot of French, they realized that indeed there was something that, and of course Fichte is probably the first who got the message. And in the famous Rede an der Deutschen Nation, he made a very forceful point about getting together and so forth. But I think by the time of the battle at Jena, Germans had started to get the point that actually they could see that even Prussia was losing, and then all these southern little princelets understood that actually something new was going on, and there might be merit in the. And then we know that they actually, I think they carried this to the most extreme extremes. They learned late, but I think they got quite far.
Still you have the Italian national state 1861, 2 years after, 59.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
another 60 years after all.
Yes, because it was a fragmented country, it was the territory, which was in fact a lot more fragmented than the Romanian Principality.
It's still happening. You have the things like that still going on.
Yes. Yeah, but still, I mean, I think by the time the beautiful novel of Tomasi di Lampedusa, Il Gatto Pardo, by the time it ends, I think Italy is there. In, let's say, more or less imperfect forms, but there is no possibility to ignore the existence of such a thing, a big thing as Italy. Before, of course, you could live. Well, the tradition of fragmentation survives even in the organization of archives. This is why they had microstoria and not the French. You could only have microstoria. All these people going to the little archives in the corner, they could do microstoria. In France, they had put them all together in 1789, discarding most of it and turning it on the place at Léal, where it is now, a beautiful mobile center in Léal.
We have our own northern league. We are better off than Argos. We have the Dutch archipelago.
My question is rather punctual. You've mentioned a certain monopoly of literary criticism and literary scholars on the topic of national specificity, and I'd like you to elaborate a bit more about it, keeping in mind that we also have, for instance, the tremendous amount of work of Dimitri Gustis and an attempt to socialize and to psychologize the topic, starting, for instance, with Drăghicescu. And we'll even have nice reactions contesting Black's philosophy from an empirical point of view at Aristotle.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. But they were precisely rejecting the idea of a national specificity that would be construed theoretically. Now, Drăghicescu had his own attempt to build an ontology, actually, himself. So he is not, let's say, Drăghicescu is interesting in the sense that he started out as in the field of psychology. He was all the way, I mean, he could have gone all the way towards the new experimental Bundian psychology, but he was also reading something else. Yes, also he had the ambition of building an ontology, so I think he is a special case. Gusti is, in my book, Gusti is a very interesting character precisely because he realizes that in France, that France had run its course as a model for Romania, and he was interested in going to study then after Paris to see what was going on in Germany. He got to the point and he came, I think, with this, this luxury of having been exposed to these two competing models of ethnicity and nationality, which were reigning supreme in Europe at the time. The contractualist, social political, the French one, and this one which was now emerging in... when he came to Romania, of course, he started his involvement in empirical research. And with this, all these beautiful, no, I'm not so, of course, he's a bigger one. No, all these inventions were less interesting. Empirical social research, the burgeoning Bucharest school, started under these auspices. Nonetheless, in the very same school, you find people whom I could easily place under the rubric ethnic ontologies. I give you only the name of Ernest Bernea. Bernea, the young student who was, because the sociological school of Bucharest had this extreme advantage. Everybody could go there, irrespective of political orientation, ideology, whatever. So they were all going out there doing field work in the villages, with the aim of building, writing out monographs, dealing village by village, covering Romania systematically, village by village. They couldn't do it. It was, let's say, for Hessian, it was like Trönov Power Bistercius to write up the encyclopedia of an existing one, but still an encyclopedia. They couldn't do it. But on the right wing fringe of the Gustian teams, you had these people who are looking exactly along the lines that I mentioned here, and I gave you Hesseni, of course, himself, but Bernard, quite interestingly, he was, we don't really know exactly what he was up to, because of course his career was broken. He was too young to elaborate, but from what we know from the materials that were published by his son, and we know that he was thinking pretty much along this line. And his questionnaires were framed exactly along this. And what do you think, for instance, to establish that the Romanian peasant thought that everything left-wing is bad? Then he could document even that, you know. Of course, sinistra, you know, the thing Italians immediately understand. This idea, which comes from Latin, was something sinister on the left. So you had in his questionnaires already, the frame, I think, was this ethnic ontology. And so it was a mixed project, I think. Let's say the left-wing populism with elements of social democracy, with a social democracy that wouldn't be narodnik. You couldn't imagine what kind of social democracy can there be. A left-wing peasantism that is not. So they were struggling with what was on offer in the political spectrum of Romania. It is a tragic story, a story of the way I read it.
Să mă știe, în efortul meu de a învăța română am cam pierdut usul englezei. Mă așteptam să te aud vorbind și de conceptul de personalitate de bază, care, printre altele, se baza și el pe aceste ontologii etnice și mai aproape de Madame de Stael, Margaret Mead. Armata americană i-a comandat niște studii despre personalitatea de bază românească și cea japoneză, care se pare că au fost utile aviatorilor americani care au căzut pe sol românesc, să știe cum să se împarte, cam cu cine vor avea de-a face, cam care e idiosincrazia populațiilor în mijlocul cărora va trebui să supraviețuiască. Adică aceste constructuri filosofice au un feedback și influențează realmente ceva real, individual în colectivitățile în care trăim. La un moment dat ne identificăm cu aceste constructuri. Există o dialectică, să spunem așa. Din alt aspect, în spațiul iberic, eu nu cred că Kant-Herder și Schwedenburger să fie avut un măcar cititor. Poate în Spania, în Portugalia deloc, dar au avut o mare influență Voltaire, Montesquieu, care au lucrat cu aceeași concepte. Chiar și Comte a avut o influență enormă asupra și, bineînțeles, triada de la Collège de France, Michelet, Quinet, Michelici, care au reconstruit într-un fel conceptul de istorie națională. Și în spațiul iberic mai are influență un concept care a venit mai în fugă, conceptul de rasă, dar nu în sensul rosemerian sau hitlerian al cuvântului, rasă ca
Așa era și în Franța, așa era peste tot, de fapt.
Esență. Acum, studiile multiculturale au, începând din anii 80, au dezvoltat acest concept de etnicitate, care cred că este o materializare a acestui feedback al ontologiei construite de intelectuali, de literatură, eventual de biologia populațiilor. Și este evident că în spațiul sud-est european avem de a face cu populații și cu istorii care dificultează enorm etnicitatea indivizilor aparținând acestor colectivități. Emigranții români în Portugalia foarte ușor să-și pierd identitatea românească. Pot trece foarte ușor de brazilieni sau datorită pronunției sau italieni, ceea ce nu se întâmplă nici când cu un emigrant portughez în Africa de Sud sau în Australia sau oriunde are emigrant. E o problemă. Acest spațiu, datorită încrucișării imperiilor în care s-a aflat, are o geografie ciudată, altele am văzut pe Facebook, o hartă engleză care arăta România undeva în România, Moldova în spațiu Valah, Valahia în spațiu moldovean și Basarabia mai sunt mai
The classics of cultural anthropology in the 1940s, of course, were dealing with this. They were, of course, they were the handmaiden of colonialism, let's say, in the strictest sense, I mean, of the military colonialism. And of course, they had to pay their respects to those who were hiring them. And of course, now, if one reads today Ruth Benedict or Margaret Mead on these particular things, on these large categories, distinctions between cultures of shame and cultures of guilt, this and that, things are, I think, a little bit more complicated. They were not writing too much about Romania. It was a very expensive description of the Romanian soul, if you want, for the paratroopers. So they didn't, it was just a sketch that had some circulation and then got into oblivion. Now, of course, the name of the notion of race in this 18th and 19th century meaning had its currency up until the 1940s, and then due to the very bad association with racism, had to be abandoned. It's there, part of the history. If you do the historical semantics of the word race, you see that there was nothing like that. There was something biological, climatological, etc., geographical, geomorphological, but this was not the fundamental point about race. Then these things were taken up. Of course, there is the feedback. My point was that these notions, as being part of the core of high cultures, they have effects. And people, if they are told, Romanians, I gave once a talk in Timișoara on the idea specifică național. For instance, looking at Alecu Russo and his descriptions of Iași in 1840. The first questions one has to ask, today people forget to ask it, is this: who is speaking? About whom? Alecu Russo himself had some problems to document his Romanianness. Then he is looking around. Then whoever was a foreigner at the time is considered for minorities such as Greeks, first of all. First, you have this combination of Aromanians, these people from Romania, who come alongside the Greeks. Some of them are of Aromanian origin, like my ancestors. I have a Greek name. They were Aromanians. And other families in the same village, who had names in Greek, which were translated from the Romanian name. So, and everybody knew in Greece, and historians even know today, that this name is only a Romanian name, only translated. The Greeks were not using it. But it is exactly an ideal territory on which to develop a theory of purity and precisely because you suddenly solve all these problems of this extraordinary mixity and promiscuity of all ethnicities as well. This is very, I think, very appealing to have something which is absolutely ethereal, abstract, linking up this little country to something that is up there on the vertical. Horizontal doesn't exist any longer.
Sorin, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned Virginia Maiano's theory of the secondary, which deals with ideas that do not die and that are lingering around without taking the the forefront. And then you mentioned just quickly the esoterical theories that were probably melted into these kind of trends that worked out the ethnic identities during the 19th century. Could you elaborate a little bit more about these esoteric theories?
If you take up Eliade, for instance. Eliade, there is an esoteric Eliade. Somebody was very interested in what today is being called Western esotericism. The field of Western esotericism as a research field is relatively new, because for people who are looking at these materials, especially from the 18th century up, which are in many ways let's say a result of the Aufklärung, a result of the onset of reason as a main competitor to these refoundational Christianities that were emerging, and this in the context of these new natural philosophies. Now, these ideas, so this field of study is again relatively new, but in the case of those who were working with esoteric materials in the 1930s, they were part of their, let's say, of their culture generale. I mean, everything from theosophy, I mean, things that now are relegated to, you know, specialized, the specialized study of something, they were part of the high culture at the time. These people were raised in this atmosphere. Sometimes it is, I am interested in the history of science, and sometimes I really have trouble, and Georgia will, I hope, second me on this, the minister, in this, because we discussed this a lot. Physics, for instance, in the 1880s in Vienna, is very hard to disentangle from esoteric speculations, which are at the time offering something a lot more interesting than science itself. This is a process that we know from the time of the Renaissance. The Christian Kabbalah and various forms of magic were offering a lot more than this burgeoning science. Ioan Petruculianu famously, for Romanian audiences, has written, has compared this competition between the wingless fly on the island of Galapagos, which was modern science, Galilean science, which normally wouldn't have any chance because the winged flies eat up the whatever they have to eat. On one particular island in the Galapagos, there is such a strong wind that these winged flies are washed out into the seas. And thus, the wingless fly, if I can put it this way, little insect, can survive and thrives. This was exactly, Culianu said, the situation in the Renaissance when the large wind of the Counter-Reformation introduced this massive censorship of the social imagination, and of this, and thus made it possible for this incipient and completely unpromising and completely anticlimactic Galilean science to win. This was, I think, the case once again in the 18th century. I think this was obviously the case for modern physics. From wherever we talk about modern physics, at least from the 1870s up, in areas, especially in the German-speaking countries, especially, I'm talking here about Vienna, it's very difficult to distinguish between, and if you take up what was, if you read this and you have read a little bit of esoteric stuff before, then you immediately recognize it everywhere. And from doctrines of social reform, to political ideologies, to it's there, not even so hidden. And this is again the culture generale of all these. They were reading the Kabbalah, and it was part of popular culture almost. Well, I'm not talking about reading the real stuff, of course, but some vulgarization, some form that was pre-translated or pre-adjusted to whatever these people could read was part of the general outlook. And I think this is why it is not purely religious, mystical, but it is also this middle ground of esotericism in which notions such as experimental science exist. Transformative experiments are very important because there are elements of magic and other transformative operations. So this is not just sort of pure abstract knowledge, but something that has something to do with changing the world. And it might well be that in the making of these, I mean, I could identify these elements in the number of cases, in the others case, obviously. But this is obviously in other orders.
Yes, I read some 40 years ago Blaga, because I had to, and I read a little Alois Riegel a few years ago. It was my choice. I cannot find any similarity between the two. They seem to have different notions of style. Yes. So if you could say a few words about this. And another question. I have come across in reading Vasile Pervan a very peculiar for me notion of nationalism, devoid of any particular peasants. For Pervan, all the peasants all over the world were alike. So it doesn't really to write about them. Do you know what kind of ideas he might have imported, or if he has come up with this by himself? That was a second.
I think the most Blaga differs from all the Western authors who have tackled the notion of style, not only from Riegel. He actually makes it very plain himself. He lists them up, and he says, whereas they make it into a paramount hegemonic category, I don't. And I think he relativizes the importance of the notion of style, which in the case of these people was hegemonic, was, let's say, paradigmatic. Not in the case of Blaga. For Blaga, this is one of the elements, but not the main. I have here the list of everyone, of all of them, in Horizon Stil in 1935, where he addresses this frontally. He says, la un Simmel, Riegel, Göringer, Frobenius, Borjak, Spengler, Kaiserling și alții. Ideea de stil devine aproape o categorie, în ghilimele, și aici este chestia că ce e o categorie, deci dacă e kantiană sau ce e categoria acolo, o categorie dominantă, pur cognitivă. Deci, in other words, this is, Blaga reproaches all these people the transformation of the notion of style into a pseudo, let's say, almost Kantian category, and he thinks this is not so. I think the poet took over to the benefit of his readers, I think. Because again, as I mentioned, I'd rather read Blaga than most of these other people on this particular notion of style. Of course, he had very difficult questions to answer, Blaga, very concrete, because when you are talking about, he was also interested in the concrete forms of culture, of course. This was a big problem for him. Also in the timeline, when does one or a culture really internalize the geomorphological habitat? You sit there for how many decades or centuries? Are Hungarians who live alongside Romanians, do they share spațiu neolitic? how long do you have to stay there in order to get it in the venue? So he had very concrete questions to address, and this is why I think he finally gave a more philosophical poetic. As to Pervan, I don't know. His, I don't know. He was, let's say, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there was something esoteric in there, because he was definitely an ascetic mystic. He was very prone, very inclined to asceticism and a kind of, I never mentioned the name of Andrei here, but of course there were other people who were dealing with ethno-psychology and psychology before. Andrei was one of them. At the time, however, his interest in that, he was not into, he was in his, before his daughter's death, so he was no theosophist or anything like that. In the case of Pervan, I'm not sure. He was interested in religious materials from antiquity, of course, that it was his job. What kind of peasants did he know? Well, I don't know. He was the son of a drunken school teacher in a village, so he had some direct evidence of the existence of the peasants in a large family. He could, for instance, support his family, such were the days, with his salary as the holder. He had high school positions were tenured at the time, right? So you you're tenured as a high school teacher, and with the money he was getting for his tenured job in the high school in Iași, he could pay the replacement and have enough money to help his many brothers and sisters who were left without help by the drunken father. So he had known, had seen peasants. I don't know.
Thank you.
Any other questions?